Hello guys, welcome to Captain Dorja's Armory. This is Captain Dorja. We're going to be doing kind of a weird video today. This is going to be World of Tanks advice number 7, and we're going to try and do a very brief history of tank design because it actually pertains to this. And then we're going to look at tank classifications that I like to use to just kind of keep the tanks straight in my mind. And before we can do that, though, we need to quickly take a look at a couple of crappy little MS Paint graphics that I made just to get a point across real quick. This right here is called the Iron Triangle, and it's one of the key concepts in tank design. And basically, what this means is each side of this triangle is one of the three main elements in a tank: firepower, mobility, and defense. And the longer the side is, that means the better that aspect is. So if you have a very long defense side, that means your tank has very good armor. Long mobility, very high, not just high speed, but a tank that's agile, a tank that's good at cross-country movement, a tank that can go through all kinds of terrain without, getting stuck. And obviously along firepower side, powerful weapons. So yeah, that's the basic idea. And in most tanks, the idea is to combine all three elements basically as equally as possible, but also as much as possible. And that can be a problem because obviously a bigger gun necessitates things like a larger turret and heavier components. More armor necessitates, better defense usually means more armor, and a lot of the times that means heavier armor, which cuts down on your mobility. And if you want to have larger guns and a larger turret and the same amount of thick armor, then you're really cutting down on mobility, unless you can get a powerful enough engine. But a powerful engine means a big engine compartment, which means a larger tank, which means more armor. You get the idea. Obviously, there are a lot more things that go into tank design than just how can we get the most firepower, armor, and mobility all at once. Things like, the quality of the craftsmanship is really important. Like, just the super quick example, the Germans over-engineered their tanks, so it took them forever to build them. So they never built very many, whereas the Russians built them to be good enough, and they built thousands of them. That's just a really quick example of one of the many other aspects that go into tank design. Things like fuel mileage and crew protection, and, stuff like that. So I just wanted to make that real quick little example and just get that out there so that when I say the Iron Triangle, you have an idea what I'm talking about. Now we're gonna do Captain Dorja's super brief history of tank design, and I'm gonna try and keep this really short. This is like the fourth time I've tried making this video because I always end up rambling on one particular subject, and it gets really long and really stupid. So we're just going to quickly look at the tech tree here. Excuse me. Basically, at the beginning of World War II, a lot of the countries had come up with a fairly similar tank design idea. They would have a medium tank and a heavy tank, and the general idea was that the medium tank was kind of the tank hunter, the tank killer, and the heavy tank was more of an infantry support tank. And that's definitely characteristic of Germany, which had the Panzer IV as a heavy tank, and the Panzer III as a medium tank. And the British, which had cruiser tanks, like obviously like the cruisers and the Crusader. Those were cruiser tanks. They were basically medium tanks. They were meant to hunt down enemy tanks and kill them and break into the rear area and disrupt everything. And they had heavy tanks like the Valentine and the Matilda and the Churchill. Except they did not call them heavy tanks, they called them infantry tanks. And, the general idea was that an infantry tank would literally advance at the pace of an infantryman and give them armor support along the way. So that's kind of the quick and dirty of how most of the countries started off. And, in Russia, they started off similar, where they had the medium tank, the T-34, and the heavy tank, the KV-1. Basically, every other tank the Russians had in service at the beginning of World War II was complete garbage. But the KV-1 and the T-34 were both pretty good, and were upgraded and modified in various ways and served throughout the entire war and after. The KV eventually transformed itself into the IS series tanks, and the T-34, it went under the T-34-85 and did a lot of, there was a lot of development work that eventually just, laid the groundwork for most of the Soviets' post-war main battle tanks. So yeah, that's just kind of the very, very brief look at the tanks at the beginning of the war. But what kind of happened during the war is, as each nation encountered other nations and the material that they had, they started having to be able to counter those enemies. So the Germans went in to all these countries like France and Poland and stuff, and they didn't really run into that many armor challenges. So the Panzer IIIs and the Panzer IVs didn't really get any better. The British, the Matildas, were actually so well armored that the Germans had to start upping their gunnery. And before too much longer, the Panzer III was not really up to the challenge, and it definitely was not up to the challenge of the Russian front. So the Germans had to start looking for bigger and more powerful tanks. Same thing with the British. They found out that the cruiser tanks were way too lightly armored and too lightly armed, and that speed was not a substitute for weapons and armor. And they actually got the M3 Lee in North Africa, and they started getting M4 Shermans from America because, frankly, they were better than the cruiser tanks. Better firepower, better armor, and mobility was good enough. So, as time went on during the war, the tanks just, each nation would develop a new tank, and the other nations would counter with a new, bigger, heavier tank. That's basically what happened throughout the war, and you see that with the Germans. They go into Russia and they encounter the T-34 and the KV-1, so they go from Panzer IIIs to Panthers. The Russians come back with IS-2s. Also, the Germans came out with Tigers as well. So the Russians came out with the IS and the IS-2 and the T-34-85. And so the Germans came out with the Tiger II. And so the Russians came out with the IS-3. And it just went up and up and up. And it was similar in the West, in the Western Front, but to a lesser degree. The Germans had the Panther and the Tiger, but mostly in the West, we mostly fought Panzer IVs. So, Shermans and Cromwells were maybe not ideal, but they were definitely able to get the job done pretty much all the time. And we had ways to fight the, heavier German armor, and it's not all about just how heavily armored they were. There were other mitigating factors that made combat on the Western Front a lot different than combat on the Eastern Front. A Tiger on the Western Front was nowhere near as dangerous as a Tiger on the Eastern Front. So anyway, though, the idea of increasing your, just getting heavier, more heavily armored, not quite as mobile tanks definitely happened in the West. We came out with the Pershing. The British did a lot of experimental designs and eventually came out with you saw the British cruiser tanks get progressively more armored, progressively more heavily armed, progressively slower. You go from the Crusader, which had basically no armor and a tiny gun but was really fast. You go to the Cromwell, which had a stronger gun, more armor, and was the same speed. But Cromwells kept getting more armor and more armor and more armor and had to slow down. Then the Brits came out with the Cromwell, or the Comet, which had, again, better protection, better firepower, not as much blazing speed. And eventually the Brits got onto the Centurion, which had a more normal speed, basically. But it had really good firepower and really good armor for the day. So the trend was definitely there in the West. And with the Americans, it was the M26 Pershing. That was our counter to the Tiger. And that was our first real heavy tank. It was later reclassified to a medium tank during the post-war. It was used a lot in Korea. But anyway, that's not the end of the trend to just keep increasing. And a big part of that was because of the IS-3. The West was really afraid of the IS-3. It was It was a low profile, very fast, very heavily armored, and had a really powerful gun. So the West was really afraid of the IS-3. And so the Brits worked on, they came out with the Conqueror, and the U.S. came out with the M103. And the main idea of the M103 and the Conqueror was that these tanks were really heavily armed, really heavily armored, and mobility wasn't really that important because they were fighting a defensive battle. And basically, the undoing of the M103 was that it was too heavy. The Army hated it. It had a lot of mechanical problems. It was unreliable. It had an abysmal road range. When this tank was gas-powered, I think its road range was 92 miles, and then it ran out of gas. That is just unacceptable. So it basically meant they could drive like 50 miles, and then they would refill their fuel tanks, and then they'd drive 50 miles, and then they would refill their fuel tanks. The Army barely used this tank at all. It was just too big, too heavy. It was ineffective. Its mobility was awful. The Marine Corps actually kept them and used them through Korea, and I'm not sure exactly how long, but the Marine Corps actually kind of liked the M103s, but the M103 never really got past its problems of being too big, too slow, too unreliable. The Conqueror, to a lesser degree, I think, faced similar problems. It was too big, it was too heavy. And the thing that's most funny about that is apparently the IS-3 wasn't even that good. I don't know the details, but people like the Chieftain, who knows way more about tanks than I ever will, say that the IS-3 was more of a threat to its own crew than to the enemy. So, all that worry for nothing. But it just illustrates the trend. The trend continued. The tanks were getting bigger and more powerful, and it got to the point where they became tanks like the M103, and they just weren't effective anymore. So, a paradigm shift had to happen, and that shift was over to the main battle tank. The Russian T-54, one of the earliest main battle tanks. The Americans shifted from tanks like, heavy tanks like the M103. They shifted over to the M48 Patton, and the British, the Centurion really became the tank to beat. And the Centurion is one of the best tanks ever designed. Just has a sterling combat record all over the world. Just like, you don't get to be a more battle-proven tank than a Centurion. It just does not happen. But the key here is that there was a paradigm shift away from the just giant increase in armor weight and firepower weight and mobility going into the crapper. A more balanced approach became more important. And as firepower continued to increase throughout the Cold War in the 60s and the 70s, it eventually got to the point where armor was almost not even that important. Tanks like the Leopard 1 on the M60 were comparatively low armor just because the firepower was so high that they weren't going to be able to prevent tanks getting knocked out. So they focused less on armor and more on firepower and more on mobility and stuff like that. Eventually, in the 80s and the 90s, we were able to move past that with various increases in armor. A lot of development of composite armors, multi-layered armors, and spaced armors really catapulted the armor back into brought armor back into the center stage. The British, with their really, really widely known cobham armor that is used by Britain and America, and things like that, just made armor really. Again, armor became important. So stuff like cobham armor and heavy use of ceramics just really brought the armor back. So now in the modern world, we have tanks like the Leopard 2A6, we have tanks like the Challenger 2, we have tanks like that American Abrams, where again they're able to achieve a very high standard of armor, but also a very high standard of firepower and mobility. So it's kind of interesting. Tank design's kind of come full circle. It started off as fairly balanced, where basically a designer had to choose between two of the three elements. So they used two classes of tanks to cover all their bases. And then during World War II, everything just got bigger and heavier until mobility became awful, basically. And then once that had happened, they realized they couldn't just go bigger and heavier. They started going to faster and lighter, And, you know, that was a paradigm shift backwards, but it was the only way to go. And it's just kind of interesting how that happened. So I just wanted to make, I just, I couldn't get it out there. I couldn't continue without doing it. So now that I've got that out of my system, we can get on to my own little personal tank classification system. And my personal tank classification system is really easy. There's three classes of tanks. There are armor tanks, there are mobility tanks, and there are gun tanks. And a really good example in World of Tanks of a gun tank is an M103. The gun is the defining characteristic of this tank. Like, an M103 without its gun is not an M103. Another really good example of that is the Tiger. The Tiger in World of Tanks is not known for having very good armor, and it's got decent mobility, but I mean, it's not a light tank. This thing, what allows the Tiger to compete as a Tier 7 heavy is this very good gun. So, those are gun tanks. Tanks with a gun is what allows them to be viable. The next thing that we have armor tanks. Tanks like the Tiger II. Tanks like the T110E3. Tanks like the T95. Armor is what keeps these big boys in the battle. The T110E3 and the T95 are just so heavily armored that you just, push them into the fight and kill stuff. The Tiger II is not armored to that extent, but it is a very heavily armored tank. So if you're able to effectively utilize the armor of this tank, it means that you're going to be able to keep yourself alive long enough to do the work that you need to do and kill all your enemies. And lastly, we have mobility tanks. Tanks like the Leopard prototype. Pretty much every light tank in the game is a mobility tank. Tanks like French tanks, like the AMX 5120. These tanks are mobility tanks. They may have very powerful guns, but without their mobility, they'd never be able to get their guns into action. Without their mobility, they would never be able to retreat and reload their autoloader. Without their mobility, when they got into a bad situation, they would never be able to run away without just dying. So those are my three classes: gun tanks, armor tanks, and mobility tanks. And similar to real tanks during the real World War II period, most tanks in World of Tanks, are able to be good performers in two of the three aspects. So a lot of the time, what we'll get if we take a look at an Iron Triangle is we'll get a tank like this, which has firepower and defense, but low mobility. Tanks like the T110E3. Tanks like the Tiger II. This tank has pretty good firepower, pretty good armor, but mobility not that great. Another common thing that we'll get is an Iron Triangle like this. Lots of firepower, lots of mobility, not a lot of defense. That's kind of a medium tank thing. Again, tanks like the Leopard prototype, lots of firepower and mobility, not a lot of armor. Tanks like the 5120, lots of firepower and mobility, not a lot of armor. So when I have a tank that is strong in multiple aspects of the Iron Triangle, I call that a hybrid tank. Most hybrid tanks tend to have one element that is superior to the rest, so I may call it a hybrid tank, but I'll also refer to it by its main characteristic. So, these are the examples we've looked at down below so far, and all of these tanks we've looked at are hybrid tanks. So the M103 I originally said was a gun tank, and that is true, but it also has exceptional mobility for a heavy tank. So in my hybrid classification, this would be a gun mobility tank. It would have an Iron Triangle like this. Lots of firepower, lots of mobility, but for a heavy tank, its armor is mediocre. The T110E3, on the other hand, this is an armor tank, but it also has very good firepower. So if I want to give this a hybrid classification, it would have an Iron Triangle like this. Lots of defense, lots of firepower, bad mobility. This tank is a gun armor tank, or an armor gun tank. If I wanted to look at the Leopard prototype, again, similar to the M103, this would be a mobility gun tank. This tank's mobility is its main characteristic, but that high mobility is backed up by a powerful gun. So this becomes a mobility gun tank. The Tiger 1, similar to the Leopard prototype, and the M103, is also a gun mobility tank. The Tiger 2 I would refer to as an armored gun tank, similar to the T110E3. And the 5120 I would refer to as a mobility gun tank, because it's very, very mobile, but its mobility is there to help the gun. Now, there are some tanks in the game that I would not give a hybrid classification. Tanks like the Mouse, that is a pure armor tank. You know, that tank has nothing going for it but lots of armor. There's also a fairly common example of tanks that are strong in all three elements, and I picked 3 examples of that, and these are my 3 examples of tanks that feature a fairly balanced iron triangle. And those tanks that I chose, just as an example, are the E75, the T54, and the IS-3. These tanks all have really powerful guns, really good armor, and really good mobility. If you know how to drive an E75, this thing is practically invulnerable. Like, a skilled player can just shrug off amazing amounts of damage in an E75. But not only that, the gun on it is very strong, and while a skilled player sits there bouncing all your shots, he's also hitting you back for 500 damage, and he's doing it 4 times a minute. So, this tank has very strong armor, and a very powerful gun. And then to just kind of cap things off and take the E75 from being a good tank to a great tank, it also has, for a tank that's as heavy and as well armed as this, it has amazing mobility, a high top speed, really good track traverse, acceleration, not the greatest, but I mean, if this thing accelerated like a medium tank, it would be overpowered as all hell. The T-54 is another good example. This tank has a really, really good Tier 9 medium tank gun, basically on par with all the other Tier 9 medium tanks, but it also has a fantastically well-armored turret, and the front hull of this tank is very bouncy. A good driver of a T-54 can shrug off a lot of firepower right on his upper plate. And just to finish it off, this is a medium tank, and it has the mobility of a medium tank. This is a very mobile tank. It's very strong on all 3 sides of the Iron Triangle, which makes this tank very, very good. Now, quick disclaimer, I would say that all of the Tier 9 medium tanks that I've so far played, except for the Leopard prototype, are pretty good on all 3 sides of the Iron Triangle. Generally with one side that's not quite so great, like the E50s, great gun, great armor, really good mobility, but not quite as mobile as a T-54. M46 Patton, great gun, great mobility, armor is not quite as good, but it can bounce a shot every now and then. The tank definitely has survivability. So I just want to get that out there. I don't want people to cry Russian bias, because frankly, pardon my French, but Russian bias at this point in time is bullshit. So there you go. And just to cap off the fact that Russian tanks are not overpowered, we're going to look at another Russian tank as an example of one that's really strong performer in all 3 aspects, the IS-3. This tank has the mobility of a medium tank, incredibly strong firepower, and a good player with this tank and its armor can just stand a tremendous amount of punishment. The turret is very well armored. The front hull is strong, especially if you can cover up the lower plate. And the side armor has a lot of spaced armor in it, which just allows the side armor to just troll people all day long. So, just because we have our 3 classes of tank doesn't mean that classes don't overlap each other. So, like I said, I mean, the E75 and the T-54 and the IS-3, those are just 3 examples of tanks that are very good performers on all 3 sides of the Iron Triangle. Most tanks, in fact, are strong on 2 sides. So even though I have 3 classifications that I use to class everything, most tanks actually fit into 2 categories. I usually just look at the main aspect that overrides the other ones. Like the mobility of the Tiger is a strong suit. It's a strong asset for the tank. But really, even with its excellent mobility for a heavy tank, the number one attribute of this tank is its gun. That's why I call this a gun tank and not a mobility tank. Same thing with the M103. You know, you get the idea by now. And it is safe to say that most tanks fall into a particular classification. Most heavy tanks are either armor tanks or gun tanks. In fact, most heavy tanks are gun armor tanks. Some, like the M103, are gun mobility tanks. You know, the AMX 5120, it's a gun mobility tank. But almost every heavy tank in the game, if you were to look at it, is actually a gun armor tank. Most medium tanks in the game are gun mobility tanks. Most tank destroyers in the game are either gun mobility tanks or gun armor tanks. Tank destroyers are kind of a little bit more ambiguous because there's the two general types of tank destroyers. There's the fast, heavily armored, or there's the fast, heavily armed, lightly armored ones, like a lot of the Russian tank destroyers, and there's the slower, heavily armed, heavily armored tank destroyers like the German ones. So you get tank destroyers are like a 50-50 split, but for the most part, if you look at most medium tanks, they tend to be gun mobility tanks. If you look at most heavy tanks, they tend to be gun armor tanks. And if you look at most tank destroyers, there's a kind of a 50-50 split where they tend to be either gun armor or gun mobility. So, and light tanks. Light tanks are usually either mobility gun tanks or they're just straight up mobility tanks. Anyway, I know this has been kind of a long video and it's been kind of a mishmash of different topics and some sort of weird discussions, but I just really wanted to get that out there. I wanted to get the Iron Triangle concept out there. I wanted to get my tank classification concept that I use out there, because the next thing that I want to talk about is I want to talk about specific tank classes and kind of general idea on how I play them. So I want to take a look at some gun tanks and look at how I play gun tanks. Excuse me. I want to take a look at some armor tanks and how I play armor tanks, and I want to take a look at some mobility tanks and just what you do with a mobility tank. And I didn't want to start doing that until I laid the groundwork and covered my bases on what I wanted to discuss. So I know this has been a garage video, and I said I was going to cut down on that, but now that I've got this out of the way, I can just hop into World of Tanks and say, hey guys, this is Captain Dorja, and we're going to look at gun tanks. I can quickly flash up the Iron Triangle, and everybody knows what I'm talking about. So, that's done. And we can get on to blowing stuff up in the next installment of World of Tanks Advice. So guys, until that time, just remember, this is Captain Dorja, and you can never have enough big guns.